contains scenes of a graphic nature. Viewer discretion is advised. This program is a compilation of interviews and footage taken from various law enforcement agencies, court records, and individuals. Any opinions expressed are their own.
The person who stumbled into this was Victoria Berry, who was Bob's co-star in Beginner's Luck. And she'd come to the apartment. He'd given her the blue key, the copy, to the Winfield apartment. There were 3 blank keys that were used for that, and Bob had one and she'd gotten one.
She shows up a little earlier than her appointed time, which was 1, I believe, in the afternoon, approximately 1 o'clock. She knocked. There was no answer. She noticed that the morning newspaper was outside the apartment on the stoop there. She picked that up, knocked again, no answer. She tried the knob, the door was unlocked. She pushed it open, and she noted that the interior of the apartment was darkened.
The apartment is totally dark. You cannot really see in the apartment without turning the light on, because Crane had put all these very, very thick drapes up to hide, all the pornography that he had, to hide the photos that he was doing, to hide what he was doing during the day and at night with all the women he was bringing back. So when she opens the door, she goes from the very bright sun of Arizona to the very dark room where Crane's body was found. And then she closes the door behind her. At that point, it's extremely dark, and she doesn't turn the light on.
She's calling Bob, no answer. She goes on into the interior of the apartment, notices a bedroom door ajar. Everything is darkened, all the drapes are pulled. She goes to the door, looks in and sees a rough outline of someone on the bed, and she walks a little closer, thinking that it's a female due to the darkened head area. And at that point in time, she noticed that it was blood, coagulated blood.
Now, Bob had told Victoria Berry a story about a woman he'd gone out with who'd been distraught and cut her wrists. And she thought, first thing she thought, this has happened again. She bends forward a little closer. And he's sleeping, sort of like this, he was asleep at the time of his death when somebody clubbed him. And she thinks, okay, it's John Carpenter, because he always stays with Bob. Now, this body is just chocolate sauce almost. You've got to imagine, this is just an unrecognizable person. Then she sees a very expensive French watch on Bob Crane's wrist. She realized it's Bob.
She then ran screaming from the apartment and got assistance from some neighbors, and they called the Scottsdale PD.
The first police officer who showed up at the scene was Paulette Cassetta. Paulette ended up, believe it or not, being my investigator on the case when I took over the case 14 years later. She left the Scottsdale Police Department and worked with the Public Defender's Office. She knew what she was doing. The first thing she did was close the door, get Victoria Berry away from the scene, stick her in her car, and then phone for backup.
When we arrived at the scene, there were obviously uniformed officers already there. They had locked the scene down. There was an officer on the door. There was an officer and, I believe, a sergeant with Victoria Berry.
Other people start arriving, and later this was one of the criticisms of the case. This crime scene, there were just tons of people smoking and using the phone, and it was not a good crime scene. But you have to say this for Scottsdale PD. They didn't get murders. This was especially a celebrity murder. Well, Lieutenant Dean and Lieutenant Borgenhagen arrived, and they took charge.
When I got to the scene, I was met by, I believe, Lieutenant Dean and Captain Pratt, and I think Detective Vassal might have been there. He might have been out checking with neighbors at the time.
We were instructed to do a knock on doors around the apartment complex to see if anybody had heard anything or seen anything. And that was in the beginning stages, within the first few minutes of arriving on the scene.
The whole group of detectives, the whole group of cops, all stormed the apartment. They all walked in. They started looking around. They started looking at lifting things up. And they started turning lights on. And then they got to the point, which was absurd, where they brought Barry, who had supposedly seen this horrific scene, and they said, come on back in.
The apartment was crowded with people smoking, and Victoria Barry was smoking. And there's always been some criticism that she was allowed to smoke at the crime scene, that anybody else were actually to do that. But as I can understand it, that they'd already dusted for prints. They'd already done a lot of this work before she began smoking. But she was extraordinarily freaked out. She's pacing and smoking and so on. The other thing was, one of the investigators was using the phone. And again, I've been reassured that it was dusted for prints, but I'm not sure on that. It was a muddy crime scene.
There was no forced entry that we could find.
The apartment was in a state of disarray, not necessarily from, suspect activity after the homicide occurred, but it was just unkept, would be the best description. There was video equipment all over the living room. There was videotapes laying about. The scene itself was in the bedroom, and under lighted conditions, it was observed that the individual had been bludgeoned to death. Pretty grotesque scene.
Mr. Crane was laying in the bed in a kind of a fetal position. There was a lot of blood around his head and on his neck, and I did observe blood spatters on the wall above the headboard of the bed. And then there was some, looked like wipe marks on the sheet where something full of blood had been wiped off. And I noticed a cord tied around his neck. Other than that, we didn't, touch anything until the medical examiner arrived.
When the coroner came and decided to examine the body, which typically means get out of the room, stop standing where you are, what don't you have on your shoes that you should have, get out, take all the bedding, close it up, close the body up, and take it back to the morgue, right, for the autopsy. He didn't do that. He decided, well, let's see what killed him.
There appeared to be semen on Bob Crane's, I don't know now if it was his right or left thigh, but at autopsy it was still there. And I asked if they would collect the semen. And the medical examiner's investigator said, what's that going to tell you besides you had a piece of ass? And they refused to collect it.
While I was doing the crime scene, I was assisted by crime scene technicians. They were doing photographing as well as fingerprinting. Lieutenant Rondine was on the scene. Sergeant Dennis Borkenhagen was on the scene. And at that time, they were attempting to interview Victoria Barry. During the interview, the phone inside the apartment was ringing, and it rang several times. Victoria Barry answered the phone each time. Lieutenant Rondine also spoke on the phone to the caller, which was later identified as John Carpenter.
I'm sitting at the apartment that I shared with my dad at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, or 3:30, and I get a phone call from John Carpenter. And John says, hi, I'm back in LA, because I knew he was coming back that day. Listen, if you need anything, let me know. And I said, everything okay? And yeah, talk to you soon, let me know if you need anything. And that was it. I was probably on the phone with him for, I don't know, maybe a minute or two. Hung up. Thought, it's kind of weird.
Throughout the morning, John Carpenter, who had returned to California, had been phoning, has anybody seen Bob? Calls the Windmill Theater, is he there, and so on. And I've always sort of thought, this is the kind of thing a guilty person would do. You're going to want to place yourself, hey, I'm in California, and I'm calling to see if you've seen Bob.
So I decided to call my dad's apartment in Scottsdale. And this was approximately 3:30, I think, on the afternoon, 29th of June. And a woman answers the phone. I go, hi, is Bob Crane there? And she goes, no, he's not here right now. And I go, who's this? Victoria. Oh, hi. Well, listen, can you just tell him, his son Bobby called and give me a call, nothing important. Give me a call, when he gets back. Yeah, sure. Hangs up. And police are there, unbeknownst to me. So I'm thinking my dad has run out for, you know, what have you, and he's going to be back soon. And she's at the apartment, you know, she's in the show. I didn't think anything weird about that. And of course, he's long gone.
Victoria Berry gradually was able to make a firm identification. They got the man who ran the Windmill Theater where Bob was appearing. He made a good, solid identification. So now they knew Bob was dead. But then finally it was put on the answering machine to the Winfield Apartments, and it became public knowledge.
I was driving his mother, my grandmother, out to see my mother and stepdad, Chuck. I pull up in front of my mom and Chuck's house. Chuck comes out the front door. Bobby, get in here. Real serious, okay? Couldn't imagine what it was. I get out, go in the front door. He says, call Lloyd Vaughn, your dad's attorney, now. Okay. Call him out. He doesn't tell me anything. I call Lloyd Vaughn. Lloyd says, there's a rumor your dad has been shot. What? I am going to Phoenix with Bill Goldstein, who was my dad's divorce attorney. Do you want to go with us? I said, absolutely.
I saw my mom and my grandmother in the kitchen crying. They couldn't even talk. They were crying so much. And so I went to another room where my stepfather and my brother Bobby were standing. And my stepfather looked at me and he said to me, Karen, your father's been shot. And that was the first sort of news that we got. Nobody was really clear about what actually happened.
I was working all day at a bank in Sherman Oaks, and I was around 19 years old. And I remember coming home that day, and I lived in a small apartment around the corner from the bank. And I remember the phone rang and my sister was on the phone. And all I heard was her scream. And I said, Karen, what's wrong? And she said, we don't have a father anymore. And I said, what are you talking about? And she says, Dad has been killed.
Lloyd Vaughn, Bill Goldstein, and myself, we go to Burbank Airport, fly to Phoenix, get there early evening. Of course, it's the end of June in Phoenix, very hot, still very light out. And by then, of course, you know, my dad's long gone. Police tell us his body is over at the police morgue. We drove over there. I went inside. I viewed his body. My emotional response was complete devastation. I'll never forget, I was sitting at a hotel that we had gotten for the night, and I just sat out by the pool in a chaise lounge, you know, staring up at the sky, crying, just completely wiped out.
When he was at home, he was a perfectly normal father like the man down the street. You could not tell the difference. My father was a wonderful father. He was very doting, very protective, very loving.
The reasons that maybe Carpenter shot to the top of the list. He's checking out of the hotel early. He's 2.5 hours early at the airport. He wants to get out of there. He wants everybody to know he's leaving. Bob has not been discovered yet. That body's lying in that locked room somewhere that no one knows about. He's got this rental car with 32 miles on it. And he says, take this car back, detail it, clean it up. I hated it. This didn't work. The light didn't work. He wants that car polished down.
You know, we knew that he was in town, according to Victoria Berry. We knew that he was in town and was visiting with Crane, and that he was residing at that time a block away from Crane's residence. And we knew that he had left that morning, the morning of the murder, and gone back to L.A. He was also, admittedly, one of the last people to see Bob Crane alive. We initially had thought that the murder weapon might have been a tire lug wrench. One of our detectives began tracking down the rental vehicle that Mr. Carpenter had. It was a hassle trying to locate it because when Carpenter had turned it in, he had written up a problem with the vehicle's electrical system, so the vehicle was taken in for maintenance. But once he found the vehicle, he found that what looked like blood on the passenger door. You know, that immediately is whistles and bells.
In 1978, we didn't have DNA testing. The only thing we had available to us in 1978 was blood typing, and that was it. The good side of that is the blood typing on the inside of the car matched Mr. Crane's blood type. Anybody else who had contact with that car did not have the same blood type as Mr. Crane. There was a trace of blood on the doorknob leading outside from the apartment. In John Carpenter's rental car, there was various points of blood on the inside passenger door. A couple of these blood transfers were as long as 6 inches in length. Now, all these different blood transfer areas was photographed by a Department of Public Safety crime scene technician.
You know, now we're dealing with probably more than just somebody to look at. You know, we need to really get a hold of this guy and talk to him.
Do you understand these rights?
I understand the rights the way you read them. My question to you is that prior to an agreement on these rights here, what I was under the impression, correct me if I'm wrong before I make my statement to you, that I was coming here to help you out, not put me in. And I'm really very apprehensive about this. If I should continue, since your statement in California was that you implied and directly told me that I had direct contact with Bob Crane's death.
Yes. In fact, okay, we'll get to that. What I need from you is, will you voluntarily answer my question? Now, reading from this rights card, you now understand, and you've been questioning. Can you stop voluntarily answering my question?
You understand? You can get up and walk out right now. Go ahead. Then I'm here to help you.
He volunteered to take a polygraph lie detector test. And the county attorney said that probably wouldn't be a good idea at this time because we don't have enough information yet to, you know, to ask him the proper questions and look for the proper responses. And he said there's a photo album, and he described it in detail for us, how it opened up and how the pictures flipped up. And he said that, you know, that would be something to look for. Well, you know, how would he know that it wasn't there? It was my question. And I always thought that that was his red herring, that, you know, let me throw this into the works here so the cops will think whoever killed him because of a picture in that album, and, you know, maybe the husband of one of his girls or something along that line. But there was a camera with film in it. There was a photo enlarger in his bathroom, the master bath, that had exposed film in it, and he was making, you know, blow-ups of these photos. And, you know, if there was some husband in there, because this thing is in plain sight, if there was some husband who wants to grab this album because his wife's picture is in it, well, what about all this other film laying around and the videotapes everywhere? You know, why just grab this one Polaroid album? He had in his date book that he was going to take John to the airport that morning, the morning of his death. He had a set of tapes, Saturday Night Fever edited versions with the cuss words cut off, laying right by the front door of his apartment. And on top of those tapes were John Carpenter's swimming trunks, which he had left there. You know, this is one more thing, you know. Crane was getting ready. He put him there because everybody told us he was forgetful, absent-minded. He put these things right by the front door to pick him up on the way out the door as he was going to pick up Carpenter and take him to the airport. But, of course, never got that far. The strange thing was, he says, remind me about urination. After you ask all the questions, I want to talk about urinating. So we asked him the questions that we wanted to ask him. And then he said, okay, Mr. Carpenter, what did you want to say about urinating? He says, well, I think it's important to know that Bob always said that after he had a jump, that he would always soon thereafter go and urinate, because that lessens the chance of contracting VD, and so he would always urinate after he had, you know, had sex. And that, to me, was almost an admission. He's saying something now that, you know, why would he think this would be important to us unless he knew there was some semen on Crane's leg? When we finished up, you know, we got his photograph, and we took him over to the hospital, got some blood sample, and then I drove him back to the airport so he could fly back to Los Angeles. And on the way to the airport, he says, so what happens now? And I said, well, we have that blood on the car, and, we'll try and match that up. And if that matches Bob Crane's blood, you're in deep shit. We met with the county attorney, Mr. Hyder, and this major felony bureau lead man, I guess he was, and asked him, what do we need to get a complaint? And this major felony bureau commander, or whatever he is, said, we need fingerprints on a murder weapon or a confession. Without that, this case is going nowhere.
Well, first of all, we're talking about a minuscule amount of blood. Secondly, there was no way to tell how long that blood had been in there as a rental car. They were able to type it, and I think it was the same type as Bob Crane's blood, but there was no evidence to show how old it was, and the car had been around for some time, and the amount was so little that it really didn't mean anything by itself.
It was very frustrating that we felt that we were not getting the cooperation that we deserved and that the family deserved in this case. We felt as if the county attorney's office was stonewalling us as opposed to aiding and assisting and trying to make this a better case or make this a prosecutable case.
They will not put on a circumstantial case. They wouldn't at the time.
Well, I determined from the meeting right away that they had focused in on one suspect, which was John Carpenter, and the evidence just wasn't there. It was more supposition or conjecture as to whether or not Carpenter had committed the crime. I told them, maybe your hunch is right in the long run, but we need evidence that we can use to prosecute. We have to be able to show beyond a reasonable doubt that whoever killed Mr. Crane killed him.
Police officers, detectives don't request a murder complaint on somebody unless you're sure this is the guy that did it. And no, there is no other suspect in my mind.
Lieutenant Rondine was in charge of investigations at the time that this incident occurred. He remained in investigations for a few years after that and has subsequently retired from the police department. Now that case was given to whatever detective was assigned to the homicide unit in Scottsdale. And whoever was assigned the unit would work on it as time allowed, along with all the other cases and assignments that they were tasked with doing.
We never closed the case. It was always open, and we did not work it actively. But you always wait for something. If something comes in, or if, it doesn't take much to say, oh yeah, let's go check this out. And there were a few things that came along later that I think rekindled it a little bit.
In fact, Bob Crane's soon-to-be ex-wife, Patty, was actually a suspect at this time.
10 days before his murder, on Father's Day, Patty and her son Scotty show up unannounced at my dad's apartment in Scottsdale. Now, they're in the middle of a bad, nasty divorce. Knock at the door. Hi, we're here. My dad just about flipped out. He couldn't believe this. They come in, they spend a very uncomfortable day or so there. And then to go back a year to a year and a half before that, my dad's will, a codicil was added to his will, eliminating me and my two sisters, the 3 children from the first marriage, from his will.
Bob thought at the time that he was poor, but he had had $100,000 embezzled from him. So he's out doing this backbreaking work, which really cost him his life in the end, when there was no reason for him to be doing this. Within a year of his death, he would come into 25% of Hogan's Heroes. That's the profits. Now, Warner Klemperer and John Banner, and Robert Clary, all the other co-stars of Hogan's Heroes, they were paid for the first 6 appearances, as was the style at the time the show was filmed. But Bob actually had a piece of the show, and had he lived, by 1990, he would have had 25% of $90 million. That's what had come in by then.
The night before the homicide, Mr. Crane had talked to Mrs. Crane on the telephone in his apartment. He had called her in Bainbridge Island, Washington. We have phone tolls that show that he called there and talked to her. We checked all the airline flights coming from Washington, whether they'd lay over in California or New Mexico or Nevada, and there were no flights after he had spoken to her that would have put her in the Phoenix area or would have allowed her to be in the Phoenix area during the time of the homicide.
The other thing I thought was intriguing, that Bob Crane, just before his death, is in the parking lot of the Windmill Theater. It's pitch black, and this car doesn't start. And later, they look at this tire. The valve core has been tampered with. Somebody was trying to strand him in that parking lot. He and John Carpenter are there. But Bob, one of the things that made him delightful, he's unpredictable. He gets into this car. He takes off toward the lights of a faraway service station, riding on the flat tire. Well, the guy is looking at it, and he realizes at the station, this thing's been tampered with. And the station attendant actually took that tire, replaced it, and kept it, because he was going to show it to police. He thought something was really up, and I think so too. I think that was the second warning for Bob Crane.
I've heard many things over the years. Mob hit, jealous boyfriend, jealous husband, drugs, this, that, whatever. I ruled that out because of, first of all, there was no break-in to the apartment where my dad was staying. There was no struggle. There was no robbery, except for they've said a photograph book. And the scene was pretty much left without turmoil, is the way I kind of gauge it. He was asleep, and he looked comfortable, you know, in his bed, no struggle. So I'm thinking back now, this is someone that he knows, the door is unlocked, and a couple of scenarios. He either lets the person in at the front door, feels comfortable enough to go to his bedroom and go to sleep. He leaves the door unlocked for a person coming over who he feels comfortable with, or the person who came over had a key.
When I first came into office in 1989, it was not a campaign issue. However, the Scottsdale Police Department still wanted the case to be reviewed. They believed they did not get a fair shot at presenting all of the evidence to an unbiased county attorney. There had been a lot of disagreements with the prior county attorney, and with the advent of DNA and the new technologies that may help us, I said, okay, let's see what we have. Let's begin to pull together all of the evidence and look at this. I mean, it's a homicide, and I felt it was very important at the time to send out a strong statement that these types of crimes are not going to be just put into a drawer, that we're going to be aggressive on them, and if you commit a murder, we want to bring those people to justice.
I really had no idea what they had in mind at that time. As a matter of fact, I was told that they needed someone with homicide experience, and they had no one, and they had a case that needed looked at really bad. So I said, sure, okay, never thinking that it was the Crane homicide until my first day on the job.
Mr. Romley decided that this was a case that was solvable, and he requested the police chief of Scottsdale allow me to work with Mr. Raines on a full-time basis to reinvestigate this case from the ground up and see if we could make it a solvable case.
I wanted, naturally, all the photographs that were taken, you know, the car and that, and the scene. I got those, I started to go through them, and I found in a notebook that had been put together by some previous county attorney investigator, I find the photograph of the tissue. And Barry was not present at that time. So when Barry joined me then at the county attorney's office on the case, I handed him the stack of photos and I said, look through these and tell me what you think. And he's flipping through the photographs, you know, and the blood smear, and he knew about all that. And then he came to the tissue, and he knew the same thing I knew. When he saw that tissue photograph, he knew exactly what it was and exactly what it meant to the case. But, you know, we were detectives, we're not pathologists. And our word is good in some cases, but we needed, you know, an expert opinion on that. Now, mind you, I called the Department of Public Safety and said, where is this tissue? And they couldn't find it. It had been lost over a 12-year period there, somewhere it had been lost. So I took the photograph to 5 well-known pathologists, and without any background information at all, asked them to render some opinion as to what the substance was. Immediately upon looking at it, each said that is subcutaneous tissue. And one of the pathologists actually even indicated to me, and I hadn't really noticed it before, that there was actually a hair coming out of the tissue, which makes it even more germane to the scene.
We went through all the physical evidence. We contacted each and every witness that was talked to in 1978. We sent some items to the Phoenix Police Crime Lab and had Mr. Ray Giesel do some reconstruction. And he actually came up with a viable murder weapon.
At the time of the homicide, the murder weapon was unknown. I mean, there were theories that it was tire irons, pipe, many things came up. Nothing actually panned out. When I observed the sheets from the bed firsthand from the Scottsdale evidence room, I observed the tool marks on the sheets, and I noticed that it was in a V shape, and I suspected possibly a tripod at that point. I took the sheets, I located a very similar tripod, and I took that to a forensic expert by the name of Raymond Giesel, who was with the Phoenix Police Department at that point in time, and asked him if he would examine these items and see if he could make any sense out of it. And about 2 days later, he called and asked me to come to his lab. I did. When I walked in, he had the sheet spread out on a table, and he laid the tripod on it, and it was an absolute perfect match. Not only did the legs match and the knurls matched, but the head of the tripod actually matched the wound.
You know, I promised the Scottsdale Police Department that I would give it a fair review, but I didn't promise them what the results would be. In the end, I decided that this case was not going to get any better. We had lost evidence already. There was a lot of problems with it. I did believe that John Carpenter had committed this crime. I believe that he had to be held accountable and let a jury decide his guilt or innocence.
The complaint was actually filed and a warrant was issued prior to our departure for California. And the way that works is we had to do a fugitive warrant in California for him to hold him on our murder charge. After we arrested him there at the scene on the fugitive charge, I approached Mr. Carpenter and I advised him of his constitutional rights. We then transported him down to the sheriff's office. And as soon as we got inside the sheriff's office, I intended to at least attempt an interview with him. And I did, and he refused. He said he wanted to talk to his attorney. And I said, no problem. He then asked to use the telephone. I took him into a small office there at the LASO, and he picked the phone up and he called his wife.
I was asleep. 7:15, the phone rang. And he said, I want you to sit down, listen to me, and I don't want you to panic. He says, they finally got me. And I said, what do you mean? He said, they got me, I'm under arrest. And I just freaked. I just started yelling, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And he said, sit down, listen to me carefully. And he told me who to call. I called Richard Dawson, and he had Mark came down, and Mark was there.
I said to John, I said, you know, from what I've read, it does not look good. You know, did you do this? And he said, no, I didn't kill my best friend. So I said to him, well, John, whether you did it or not, what I am interested in is the truth. I want to find out what happened. And if you didn't do it, then I will do what I can to get the word out to let people know that maybe there's another side to this story. And, you know, what the police and the prosecution are saying, maybe there's another spin.
There are people seen loitering. There's a red-haired guy that was a suspect. There's the angry husband, connected, by the way, to the mob, who's angry at Bob, who's been bothering his wife. There's a red-haired woman. There's a woman that looks like Patty, his wife, and their son Scotty, who's at the front door one morning, who's seen. Just so, it's very, very complex to lay this out. But gradually, Bob is swept along by fate till it comes to that last evening. Now, every time Bob Crane stayed in a hotel or a motel, whatever it is, this is the Winfield Apartments, John Carpenter stayed with him. There were unusual things happening that last day of his life. John did not stay with him. He had to stay somewhere else. The date did not go well. John goes home without him. That night, and this is the part I think as a mystery that I like about the Bob Crane case. He's in the apartment. Bob double locks everything. He'd been robbed in Chicago. He makes sure nobody's coming there. He's an extraordinarily light sleeper. There are things in that apartment that should have been there that weren't. There were things that were in that apartment that shouldn't have been there at all. Among the things that should not have been in that apartment were whiskey. Bob was a teetotaler. There was beer. There's John Carpenter's swimming trunks that were supposed to go back with him to Los Angeles. Cigarettes, Bob did not smoke. Anyway, I thought there was a treasure trove of evidence that were there. But what was missing, some of the albums were gone, that Bob had these pictures. Now, this leads you to believe there's something in those albums that's incriminating. There are videos that are gone. There is in the projector that somebody overlooked pictures of a woman in various stages of undress that the killer did not remember to take.
Victoria Berry's behavior was very unusual. When she testified, she had indicated that she had made this appointment to see Crane the night before. And she was on the stage and said, "Can I see you tomorrow around 2 o'clock?" And he said, "Fine." At about 2 in the morning, she leaves her apartment to make a phone call, supposedly to her boyfriend, Mr. Wells. But Mr. Wells denies receiving that phone call. Well, when you get into Bob Crane's room where his body's found, on the nightstand right next to him is the phone, there's a light, and his date book is open to the next day. Now, covering that date book is, of course, specks of blood that were either received in the attack or by carnage. We can't figure out at this point. But it appeared to me that what had happened is apparently Crane had received a call when he was in his bed from Berry, and in response to her reminding him, had in fact noted the appointment for the next day. Now, she denies making that phone call, but everything seems to be consistent with that. There's a pen there, there's his eyeglasses there, the phone's there, the date book's open, and everything is there relating to her coming the next day.
The morning of the 29th, when Bob's body was found, you had some neighbors that were kind of upstairs off to the left that were moving in. There was a moving van with 3 movers.
I had been on a news program which aired nationwide, and one of these movers had seen this program and had called me at the Scottsdale Police Department to say that he was one of the movers and that he wanted to talk to me about what he had seen. What he told me was that he and his friend were loading furniture out of this moving van, and they had seen a female, which he described as good-looking, walk through the parking lot and go to where Mr. Crane's apartment was. And within a matter of seconds or minutes, she came out of the apartment screaming hysterically. He had also told me that he had seen what he thought was a man that had come out of the same apartment. They had smoked cigarettes together, and the man had gotten into a car and left the area.
The killer was trapped inside that apartment because out front are 2 guys in a truck, and it's 4 a.m. in the morning. They're waiting to move, the coolest time in blistering Scottsdale. And you can see the marks of the killer in that apartment. He goes to the window. You see the bloody fingerprints where he's pulled back the curtain. The men see someone in there, and they're waiting. He cannot leave this apartment. Finally, he gets his chance, and they see him driving off. They can't identify him, but he's in a white car.
We always knew that there were movers there. We didn't know who they were. We didn't know where they went. The information he gave us at that time, the description of the person that he gave us, matched that of John Carpenter.
Carolyn Beret is the last known person to have been with Bob Crane while he was alive. She was a blonde woman that he had met there. She accompanied him and John Carpenter and Carol Newell at the safari where they had their breakfast. Carolyn Beret is interesting because for many, many years she had said that she knew that Bob Crane had been murdered at roughly 10 a.m. in the morning. She then left town. She felt that she was, in fear of her life.
Now, this case of Bob Crane is very, very symbolic. What is interesting about it is he's killed with a video camera tripod. The intriguing thing is what he did after Bob was dead. he ties the cord to the VCR around Bob's neck like a bow. Well, it's cut with a very sharp knife, a pocket knife. I don't know too many women carry a pocket knife. But I think that VCR cord around his neck was a symbol of a severed relationship.
Everyone said, well, John did that for some symbolic reason. Well, what's more likely? A man would tie a VCR cord after he killed someone for no reason, because he's not on the film doing anything, and they've got films of him having sex with a guy all the time. Or a woman who found out she was being secretly taped. You needed to hear of all the other fingerprints that were found in Mr. Crane's apartment. The vast majority of fingerprints collected, which were usable, were not identified. You needed to know that. That's evidence. You needed to know that there were no bloody fingerprints or palm prints or footprints belonging to Mr. Carpenter at the scene. You needed to know that. You need to know how many times Mr. Crane masturbated. Did you need to see a film of two friends engaging in sexual activity?
At the time, the state got around in their case to playing the so-called sex tape, the videotape of the menage a trois between Mr. Crane, Mr. Carpenter, and a young woman from Texas, I believe it was. They appeared to be bored, if not embarrassed for the state of Arizona that the prosecution would put this tape on in an attempt to sway them emotionally.
When they were playing the video, nobody really cared, because that's their private life that had nothing to do with the murder in all of our opinions.
The strengths of the state's case relied in the circumstantial evidence. In fact, it was entirely a circumstantial evidence case. There was no direct evidence, an eyewitness, for example, that said that John Carpenter murdered Bob Crane. The weaknesses of the case was the same. It was strictly circumstantial, and although there was no distinction in the law between a circumstantial case and a case where there is direct evidence, juries like to see some direct evidence. Bob Crane Sr. told his son that John Carpenter was becoming a pain in the ass. He told him that John Carpenter was too much of a hanger-on, becoming a nuisance to the point of being obnoxious, and he indicated that I've got to make a change here. There is a tendency for a jury to ask a question, why? Why are we getting this now? What's new about this case that now that we should believe that this is a good case? And you had the same evidence 12 years ago and you didn't bring it forward. We tried to demonstrate to them that there was something new, some photographs that had been found.
The state of Arizona presented their case as having a smoking gun, to use the vernacular of the streets. That smoking gun was allegedly some human matter that had been deposited upon the door panel of Mr. Carpenter's rental car. The problem being for the state that no one had ever collected it, no one had ever actually seen it. None of the detectives or criminalists or technicians that had testified ever could say they actually saw it. There was a photograph of something. That photograph was discovered in a box of photographs 15 years later, and no one could say that they'd photographed it or seen it.
The human tissue caused a disturbance in all our minds only because of the fact that it was missing. That was the key factor, because it was Carpenter's car that this tissue was in.
When lawyers are in that situation, under Arizona law, the judge can give what's called a Willits instruction to the jury at the conclusion of the case. The Willits instruction allows the jury to consider that if there was a piece of evidence that may have existed that the state failed to preserve for defense testing, jury presentation, then they're allowed to consider that as part of the weakness of the state's case against the defendant.
The Willits instruction had to go to the destruction or the release or the for lack of a better term, the non-existence anymore of the piece of tissue that was on the car door panel. And I can't say how that impacted the jurors or how that impacted their decision, but I can say that had we had that piece of tissue, we would have been in a lot better shape.
Not one of the 5 doctors that the state dragged in from all over the country could give you a time of death, which means Mr. Crane could have been murdered before 8:36 or after 8:36 in the morning. What the state chooses for you to believe is that even with the absence of any testimony as to time of death, that it had to have been prior to Mr. Carpenter leaving. Must have been. Otherwise, Mr. Carpenter couldn't have done it, and they know that. So their argument to you, without one scintilla of evidence, is that in fact it was before 8:36 in the morning.
There's a few things that were in evidence that Judge Martin said that we didn't have to take into account, only because of the fact that there was no scientific proof of what it was. Just like the tissue, for example. That's one thing that he said that we didn't have to take into account, only because of the fact that it wasn't proven either way.
It was type B blood that was on the car door panel. If we had been able to get some enzyme testing, we may have been able to convince the jury that this indeed was Bob Crane's blood. I think if they believed that it was Bob Crane's blood and that blood had been transferred from some type of instrument, then I think they would have convicted him. During the original investigation, the blood was analyzed by the Department of Public Safety. Then it was sent out to another outfit in Minnesota, so that each time that sample was analyzed, it was reduced. And by the time DNA was available, there wasn't enough left to get the job done for us. Now, if we were prosecuting that case today and we had that same sample, because of the advances in DNA, I think we probably would. We sent out a sample to Cellmark Laboratories in California. They did find human DNA on the car door panel in the area where the blood was, but they weren't able to take that next step and say that it was Bob Crane's. There was nothing inconsistent with Bob Crane's DNA, but they weren't able to take that next step because of the volume and say that it was indeed Bob Crane's DNA.
DNA was a big factor, because if there would have been DNA on that car door of Bob Crane, I can guarantee that John Carpenter would have been found guilty. I mean, no questions asked about that.
We, the jury, duly impaneled and sworn in the above entitled action upon our oaths, do find the defendant not guilty of murder in the first degree. Signed, foreperson, Michael E. Lake. Is this your true verdict, so say you one and all?
Yes. Is either party want the jury polled? No, Your Honor.
It's over. It's over. The people who really know John know he did not do it, and he's not capable of that. He told me I have to sit there day after day after day. It took a lot out of him.
The last few years of John Carpenter's life, he was financially ruined. He was emotionally ruined, philosophically and spiritually broken. He had lost his job at Kenwood. They kept it as long as he could. It took its toll on him at the end, and I think he tried his best not to let on to people that were close to him how much it did affect him. You know, that just the stresses and the things that had gone on. John Carpenter had longevity in his family. All of his aunts and uncles and that, they lived to, if not into their hundreds, close to in their 90s. And, here he was at, 72 years of age, died of a heart attack.